All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Sarah Karansky, and I'm the Education Coordinator at United Against Human Trafficking. And today we will be talking about how can healthcare professionals not only identify human trafficking through their work, but also respond to it. So I just want to take a moment and say, first of all, thank you all for joining us. We're throughout this webinar, we will be doing a case study together. So I just want to test out on the right-hand side on your dashboard. Everyone should have a raise hand icon. We're going to be using that during today's webinar. So if everyone could just test it out for me so I know that you've all found it, that would be great. All right, perfect. It looks like the vast majority of you have found your raise hand icon, and I appreciate that. So yes, thank you all for joining us this afternoon, and we're going to go ahead and jump right in. So just a brief introduction. I work for an organization called United Against Human Trafficking. We are based out of Houston, Texas, and our mission, just as our name would suggest, is to combat human trafficking. And we do this through three different avenues, the first of which is awareness. Sometimes we realize that's where we need to start, is by raising people's awareness levels that not only does human trafficking exist, it exists here in our communities. I always consider raising awareness as letting people know that human trafficking is not like what we see in the movies. It's not as obvious and dramatic and violent as we often see in movies and TV shows. But in reality, it's much more subtle. And so to do that, we offer volunteer opportunities, community engagement, presentations, things like that. We also work in education. So as the education coordinator, this is my primary responsibility. I facilitate frontline professional trainings for those who are considered important stakeholders. And so it's exactly what we're doing right now. We train professions and professionals who have the greatest opportunity to identify human trafficking, to do so more and to do so more effectively. So for example, law enforcement, healthcare professionals, social service providers, educators. These are all groups that we know have an incredible amount of opportunity to identify human trafficking. The other side of education is that we have some incredible youth programs. So we work in middle school and high school, with middle school and high school age students, but we are not just in schools. So we work in schools, juvenile detention centers, treatment facilities, anywhere we can be talking to kids. And talking to kids not only about what is human trafficking, but also what are the resources, what are the tools and the knowledge that they need to protect themselves. And then as an organization, we also work in outreach. So we have a direct outreach team who work with what are considered vulnerable populations. So they work in places like homeless shelters, substance abuse treatment facilities, day labor sites. They're on the streets even, not only engaging these populations in what is human trafficking again, but really the primary focus of our outreach team is how can we help connect you to resources? What is it that's available in the community, and what is it that you need in this moment so we can help you find that? So that was a very quick introduction to our organization, United Against Human Trafficking. But I'm going to go ahead and get started on the webinar. But before I do also want to let everyone know that we are going to be having the Q&A section right at the end. So if you have any questions throughout, please feel free to submit them through the chat, and I'll be giving some time later to answer your questions. So this presentation is titled Human Trafficking and Health Professionals Look Beneath the Surface and Hear Your Patient. Here is an acronym for what we're really going to be talking about. Number one, H, human trafficking. What is it? What is it realistically? Let's address some of those myths and misconceptions that we often hear about. E is for examine. This is going to be some time when we take a look at red flags and indicators that you can, as health professionals, be keeping an eye out for when examining and working with patients. A is for ask. So should we believe that one of our patients is being trafficked, should we start to suspect human trafficking, we might need more information. So how do we do that without further harming our patients, right? We never want to be someone that causes more harm, but we do need to ask for some certain information. So we'll talk about that. And then the last thing that we do, should we ever suspect human trafficking, how do we respond? What do response protocols look like? Who do we call? What does HIPAA allow us to report? Everything like that we'll be talking about today. So what is human trafficking? A little bit of historical background. First, I'm sorry. Why is it so important that you as health professionals know what human trafficking is, know how to identify and know how to respond to it? So one study that was done actually estimates that 88% of human trafficking victims, this study specifically was domestic sex trafficking victims, will come into contact with a healthcare system in one way or another while in captivity and remain unidentified. So that's an incredible amount of opportunity that you as health professionals have. 88% is the estimate. So for most of you, depending on your roles and depending on how long you've been on the job, you may have already come across human trafficking, or you may come across it in the future. This is more than likely not maybe one day at some point in my career, but an actual fact that you will be seeing this one day. So a little bit of historical information. So human trafficking has only really been talked about in the last few decades. So Congress passed the Trafficking Victims Protection Act in 2000, and this was the first time that human trafficking became illegal in the United States. And one of the crazier things about this is that we were the first country to actually do so. So this is a new movement around the world. 20 years is not a very long time if we were to compare it to other social justice movements. And if we were so inclined to look at the evolution of this anti-trafficking movement over the last 20 years, we'd see a lot of changes. So for example, in the early 2000s, we were very focused on foreign national victims. There was this understanding at the time that there's no way this could happen to U.S. citizens. But what we know now is that's just simply not true. So for the last 20 years, we've really been learning who are these traffickers, who are their victims, what are their recruitment tactics. Something else that the TVPA gave us, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act gave us, is a legal definition of human trafficking. And this was really important because what this did is it created cohesion. Now we're all looking for the same things because of this legal definition. And so what we do is we break it down into the AMP model, an action, a means, and a purpose. So if we can identify at least one thing from each column, this is human trafficking. So number one, has an action occurred? This is the recruiting, harboring, the transporting, the obtaining, the providing, the advertising, or the soliciting. Has an action occurred? But the action must occur by a means of control. So the TVPA was pretty explicit in the three terms that they used: force, fraud, or coercion. But really the way that they manifest, these three manifest, is what makes every human trafficking situation unique, right? There's really no such thing as a textbook case. And for the most part, it's because of how force, fraud, and coercion might manifest. So let's break those down a little bit. Force is a physical means of control. This is what most people often picture when they hear the words human trafficking. So this might look like physical assault, sexual assault, isolation, starvation, kidnappings, for example. As I'm sure many of you can imagine, I get a lot of questions about white vans snatching people off the street to traffic them. But to be fair, or to be frank, force is actually more often used to maintain control rather than to initiate it. What we're going to discuss in just a little bit is how traffickers don't need to use physical force to create control. What we actually see most often are fraud and coercion. So fraud is exactly what it sounds like, right? It's a false promise or a lie. And we'll see this in two distinct ways usually. The first of which is as a false job offer. So someone is promised a job that either doesn't exist or is just very different from what they were promised. Or we'll see fraud as a false romantic relationship. Something that I want you all to keep in mind is that traffickers are in this for the long con. And so in these relationships, what they're doing is they're wooing their victims. They're dating them. They're making them believe that they're in love. And they're building an emotional bond and trust that they can then use to manipulate. That's fraud. The last element of means, right, means of control that we see is coercion. So force was a physical means of control, and coercion is a psychological means of control. So coercion might look like threats against the victims or their family members. Coercion might look like blackmail in many different forms. And coercion might also look like the taking of IDs. So traffickers will take victims' identification documents, their driver's licenses and passports and visas, and they create control that way. I mean, to put it pretty simply, it's pretty scary in today's political climate not to have control over our IDs. So traffickers will use that. So something I want you as healthcare professionals to consider is that most hospitals and doctors' offices and clinics have an intake process that asks for ID. And what we tend to hear pretty often is that it's common for people to say, oh, we don't have it. So just keeping in mind, maybe one quick follow-up question if someone says they don't have their ID, maybe follow it up with a very easy, oh, okay, well, do you know where it is? By asking someone if they know where their ID is, we might get a lot of information. So an action by a means of control for the purpose. Now, here in the US, we define human trafficking in two types. We have labor trafficking and sex trafficking. So for the purpose of either sexual exploitation or labor exploitation. And I am going to talk about labor exploitation first. And honestly, one of the reasons for that is just a lot of people really aren't talking about it just yet. Labor exploitation is essentially breaking any labor law. So not being paid enough, working too many hours, no breaks, unsafe work environments, things like that can all be considered labor exploitation. Now, the problem is that identifying labor exploitation in and of itself is incredibly difficult. It puts a lot of the burden on that individual knowing their own labor rights. And labor rights, unfortunately, are just not inherently taught here, right? We never took a class on it in high school, for example. What most people tend to know about their own labor rights, we've had to learn through experience. And so that just makes identifying labor exploitation even more difficult. For sexual exploitation, we do mean engaging in a commercial sex act. A commercial sex act is engaging in a sexual act in exchange for something of value. But I want to be very clear here, something of value does not only mean money. Money does not have to change hands for a commercial sex act to occur. Maybe something of value or a commercial sex act can be exchanging a sexual act in exchange for shelter, a ride, safety, a meal, drugs, right? Whatever a person deems valuable in that moment can be considered. If it's exchanged for a sexual act, can be considered a commercial sex act. And that's one of those really big myths about human trafficking. One of the questions I get most often is, oh, well, the victim was paid, or it was never about the money. And that doesn't matter. So an action by a means for the purpose. This is human trafficking. However, so this is the rule. However, there is an exception to the rule. So your exception to the rule is if the victim is a minor. If the victim is under the age of 18, you do not have to prove force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of sexual exploitation. So it's a very specific exception. For the purpose of the sexual exploitation of a minor, we do not have to prove force, fraud, or coercion. And the reason for this exception really stems from age of consent laws. But because this is a federal law, 18 is that age across the country. And so that's really important for everyone to keep in mind. So if we dive into this exception just a little bit further, a minor engaging in a commercial sex act, a minor exchanging any sexual act for something of value is automatically a victim of trafficking, as the law is written. There is no such thing as a child prostitute. They don't exist, as the law is written. So that's just a really important piece for all of us to remember. So throughout this presentation, we're going to meet Kate, and we're going to work through this case study together. So here's our first introduction to Kate. Kate is a 22-year-old female who goes to her local ER with severe stomach pains. A man identifies himself as Kate's brother-in-law and offers to translate for her. He explains that Kate has had stomach pains recently, but because she is uninsured, she has not seen a doctor. So I want us to use our raise our hand tool, and I want you to go ahead and answer, is this human trafficking? If you think that yes, it is human trafficking based on what we know of Kate, go ahead and raise your hand. Okay. It looks like we're actually almost pretty split. It looks pretty even down the line, pretty split between yes or no. So based on what we know of Kate so far, I would have to say we don't have enough to say that this is human trafficking, right? Remember, we just talked about the action, the means, and the purpose. What we have here are potential indicators that we need more information. But based on what we currently know of Kate, I don't think that we do have enough information to say, yes, definitively, this is human trafficking. But don't worry, we're going to meet Kate again in just a little bit, and we're going to learn more about her story. So a little bit about statistics before I explain this slide. Human trafficking data is incredibly hard to come by. This is an overly hidden and clandestine crime, which means that any reliable data that we have on human trafficking tends to be estimates. And so I just really wanted to clarify that for you. These are not hard and fast figures. Some people believe that they are low. Some people believe that they are high. That's really going to be up to you to decide as we move forward. But just keep in mind that these are estimates. So the International Labor Organization estimates that there are 24.9 million victims of human trafficking around the world. 55% of these victims are female, and 45% are estimated to be male. That's pretty close to equal, isn't it? That tends to surprise a lot of people. When we think of human trafficking, we tend to picture women, or more specifically, young women, young girls who are being victimized. But this report is actually sharing that it's almost close to equal. This same report also estimates that 74% of these victims are adults and 26% are children. Again, who do we tend to consider as more likely to be victimized? Children is what usually comes to mind, but this is showing us that adults are actually very vulnerable. Keeping in mind once more that these are estimates. So on your screen, what you should see is a list of crimes that are most often confused with human trafficking. Things like human smuggling, hostage taking, prostitution, child abuse, domestic violence, sexual assault, wage theft, kidnapping. These are crimes that are often confused with human trafficking. However, they are very different crimes. And so I'm going to talk about two of them specifically. Human smuggling and human trafficking are two different crimes, but a lot of people try and use these terms interchangeably. These terms are not synonymous. Human smuggling is the illegal transportation of a person over an international border. The commodity that's being sold in human smuggling is a transportation service. To put it very simply, someone is paying for a ride. In human trafficking, the commodity that's being sold is a person. So two different crimes. Now, that being said, a person being smuggled into a country has a lot of vulnerabilities that they might then be exploited and trafficked. So smuggling can turn into trafficking, but they are not the same thing. The second crime that I do want to clarify is prostitution. Prostitution and human trafficking, specifically sex trafficking here, are not the same crime. As the laws are currently written, prostitution involves two parties, right? We have the seller of sex, the person selling their body, and the buyer. This is a consensual transaction made between two parties. When we talk about human trafficking, we often refer to the trafficking triangle now. So now we have three parties: the seller of sex, the buyer, and the trafficker. The trafficker is the one who's controlling that transaction, who's mediating it somehow. Remember all of those force, fraud, and coercion elements? That's what the trafficker is currently doing. So prostitution and sex trafficking are two different crimes. Following that through a little bit further, saying pimp-controlled prostitution is often a misnomer. Pimps are traffickers, as the laws are currently written. If any of you have any questions about how human trafficking differs from any of these other crimes, please feel free to submit that in the chat and we'll talk about it at the end of the webinar. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at red flags. Before we jump in, let's meet Kate one more time, or again, sorry, not one more time. So Kate does not make eye contact with ER staff or her brother-in-law. A nurse explains to Kate's brother-in-law that she needs to examine each patient privately, and the brother-in-law says something harshly to Kate in Spanish. All right, so once again, I'm going to ask you to use your raise your hand tool. Based on what we know of Kate now, do we think that this is human trafficking? If you think yes, this is human trafficking, go ahead and raise your hand. All right, it looks like the majority of us think that this is not human trafficking based on what we know. And I think you'd be right. I don't think we have enough information yet to identify this as suspected human trafficking. However, I do think that what we're seeing are some red flags. And so that's what we're going to talk about now. What are these red flags and indicators that I often say should make our guts scream at us? Before we move into them, I always do like to point out that red flags are small little puzzle pieces to a much larger picture. Seeing one red flag may not equate to human trafficking. Even seeing a couple may not equate to human trafficking. But when we start to identify more and more red flags, our gut is just screaming at us that something is going on. And for some reason in the back of your head, you're remembering that human trafficking training you attended. That's when we're going to need more information. But you're going to see a few red flags up here and you're going to say, okay, well, there's a lot of reasons for that. And you're absolutely correct. It's when we start putting all these puzzle pieces together that we're looking for. So first, we're going to look for indicators of being controlled. Physical indicators, the first one I always refer to them as, the buddy that's always with them, that person who's always with them, answering all the questions, controlling the conversations. That's a physical indicator of being controlled. Another one is restricted or scripted communication. We all know that feeling when we are talking to someone and it just doesn't feel like a conversation is flowing the way that they should be. Maybe they're just giving you the answers that they think you want to hear. That might be a physical indicator that someone is controlling them. Psychological indicators include frequent texting or phone calls. And this is unusual frequent texting or phone calls, especially while they're in appointments. If you are someone who is asking questions about their medical history or just their history in general, and they have to keep texting someone to find out, maybe that's an indicator. And then if they're appearing unusually anxious or hurried. Now, I did put the word unusually here very purposefully because what I found is that being in a healthcare setting often incites some sort of anxiety or fear in people, depending on their situation. And so it's really going to be at your discretion when you know that that anxiety or that fear is out of the norm. That might be an indicator. Physical indicators, we are looking for things like tension headaches, right? That's one of the ones I always use. There's a lot of reasons for that. Dental neglect, branding tattoos, suspicious injuries, alcohol or substance abuse, gastrointestinal complaints, chronic pain or illness, or signs of physical abuse. I do want to talk about branding tattoos specifically. Branding tattoos, unfortunately, are all too common in human trafficking. They're used to depict that a person is, quote, property of someone else, and they tend to be in very visible places: hands, wrists, arms, shoulders, chests, necks, places like that. And they used to be a little more obvious, right? Things like names and initials connected with some symbol of royalty or money. So, for example, a tattoo design that was a name with a little crown attached to it. Those used to be more common branding tattoo designs, but in recent years, we've actually seen a shift away from them, and they've become much more subtle. So now we're seeing branding tattoo designs of stars, horseshoes, anchors, roosters. We have a recent case, a trafficker branded his victim with the Superman symbol. No one's going to see a Superman tattoo and guess human trafficking. So what we're really looking for here are visible and matching tattoos. If you start to see the same or similar designs on different people, go ahead and ask about them. Anyone with a visible tattoo has probably been asked about it in their life. So don't be afraid to throw out an easy question of, hey, that's a really cool tattoo. Why'd you get that one? Their response might give us a lot of information, because if they turn around and say, oh, my boyfriend really likes tattoos, that's a red flag. Or if they say, oh, my aunt wanted everyone in the family to get them, that's a red flag. So don't be afraid to ask about tattoos. Other indicators include signs of neglect. So things like lack of preventative health care, chronic illness, dermatological problems, dental neglect is always a big one, weight loss or malnourishment or poor hygiene. Really the thing to remember here is that victims of trafficking are not in positions where they are able to take care of themselves or are being taken care of. And so there are physical signs of that we need to be aware of and keeping an eye out for. When taking a patient's history or learning more about their experiences or stories, what we're looking for here is if someone is lying about their age. And I know that's a really hard thing to tell, but for example, if someone is claiming to be 26 and you'd be shocked if they're over the age of 16, that should always be noted. Inconsistencies in stories, right? If stories start to change over time, we want to be asking ourselves what's going on there, right? Maybe they're forgetting the script that they've been giving, or we know that gaps in memory is a symptom of trauma. So maybe their stories changing is actually a gap in their memory. Again, we're looking for scripted communication. We're looking for clothing inconsistent with the weather. If they're carrying false ID, if they are unaware of their community or whereabouts. Now, when we talked about the AMP model at the beginning, something I didn't point out just then, as I want to point out now, is that movement is not necessary for trafficking to occur. People can be trafficked out of their own homes, neighborhoods, schools, communities. However, oftentimes a tool of control that traffickers use is frequent movement. Right? They'll move their victims around, whether it's city to city or between states. And the reason for that is because a person is less likely to ask for help if they are unaware of their own, if they don't know where they are. And so that unaware of their community or their whereabouts could be a red flag. And then if they have a history of running away, we want to be asking ourselves, what are they running away from? Or what are they running away to? A few more red flags include things like chronic pelvic pain, multiple STIs, genital or anal trauma. We're looking for unwanted pregnancies, abortion-related complications, or neglected pregnancy complications. These are all red flags, especially as they start to combine with others that we've already discussed. And then we want to look at symptoms of trauma. If we suspect that a person has been trafficked, what that means is that we suspect that they have been severely traumatized. And we know that that type of trauma manifests both physically and psychologically. So we are looking for things like depression, PTSD, disassociation, sleeping problems, sometimes self-induced sleeping problems, hostile or aggressive behavior, symptoms of anxiety, suicidal ideation, substance abuse, feelings of guilt or shame, low self-esteem, fearfulness, poor interpersonal skills. These are all symptoms of a person's trauma. The one I always like to point out is hostile or aggressive behavior. Maybe they're not trying to make your day difficult. Maybe it's a response to their own trauma. So how is it that we can consider that and take a step back before we react? So let's meet Kate again. Through the interpreter, Kate informs the nurse she helps clean her brother-in-law's house and provides child care. While she loves him and his children, Kate is stressed because she works 14 hours every day. He supervises all of her phone calls and scrutinizes every phone bill. All right. So once again, we're going to use our raise our hand tool. And if you think that yes, this is human trafficking based on what we know, go ahead and raise your hand. All right, it looks like we are once again about split, pretty close to even. About half of us think that yes, we would suspect human trafficking, and the other half is saying no. And I'm going to make an assumption here that you are saying no, we don't know yet, because it's kind of what we've been talking about. And I'd say that we definitely have some red flags. If human trafficking would have already popped into your head, I don't think that you're wrong, but I do think that we need more information. So what are some of these red flags that we've seen? Well, we have a brother-in-law who's coming to her doctor's appointment who seems very controlling, right? He tried to translate for her. He was speaking to her harshly. She's also shared that he is controlling of her by monitoring her phone calls and scrutinizing her phone bills. We see that she's working 14 hours every day, which isn't necessarily labor exploitation right there, but it's something that we would need to know that she's being properly compensated for. So things like that are definitely standing out, and I would say that we need more information for sure. So how do we get that information? We must ask, and I know sometimes asking about these hard topics isn't always comfortable or easy, and we often will worry that if we ask the wrong thing, we might further harm this individual, and we never want to be that person that causes harm, which is why we encourage something called trauma-informed care. And so for a lot of you, you're probably very aware of it, but for some people, this might be an introduction if you haven't heard of it before. So trauma-informed care recognizes that victims of human trafficking have been severely traumatized and that trauma manifests, right? We also, to be trauma-informed, we need to understand what trauma triggers look like so that we can mitigate any potential responses to them. We always want to avoid judgmental or confrontational statements. We're not here to judge other people's experiences. We're just here to get to know them and to learn about them. And then we always want to provide information, right? Including transparency and about our own processes. So just a little bit of information about trauma triggers in a healthcare setting. These are things that if you're aware of them might trigger a person, we can keep an eye out for and potentially mitigate any responses. So things like white lab coats, x-rays, medical equipment, sirens, dental drills, chaotic environments, rubbing alcohol, latex gloves, antiseptic odors. These are all things that can be considered trauma triggers. And this is not me coming in and saying you should get rid of them, right? That we should stop using sirens because they might trigger someone. No. What we're saying is that if we're aware that these might trigger someone, we can help mitigate that. So for example, I heard a survivor of human trafficking speak once, and she shared that cold rooms were often a trigger for her. It brought her back to the hotel rooms that she had been trafficked through. And I don't know about any of you, but have you ever been in a doctor's office or hospital that is not somewhat cold? Because I haven't. They tend to be on the colder side. And so that's not me coming in saying that because this cold rooms might be a trigger, we should turn up the thermostat everywhere. But if you see someone responding to the cold room, being triggered by it, maybe offering them a blanket will help create that sense of safety that they need. So how do we mitigate responses? And then we need to ask for more information. I always encourage open-ended questions as much as possible. I personally love the phrase, tell me about. Tell me about allows that person to share what they want, how they want, and in the order that they want, or in the order that they feel safest. But if you suspect human trafficking, you've seen some red flags, we do need to ask for certain information. So asking about any significant relationships, their jobs or school, their living situations, if they've expressed a need to pay off a debt, let's ask about all of those red flags that we've seen. So for example, asking someone, you mentioned that was your boyfriend outside in the waiting room. Tell me more about him. And then you ask the follow-up questions, right? Tell me about him. Oh, how did you meet? What was your first date like? Or if someone comes in with a work-related injury, tell me more about your job. And then you ask your follow-ups. How did you find that job? Were you recruited? But tell me about allows those conversations to start in a way that they can lead what they share. All right, so let's meet Kate again. Hospital staff diagnose Kate with a stomach ulcer and write her a prescription. Obviously troubled, Kate says she's been to another ER before and had the same diagnosis. She stopped taking the medicine because she had trouble saving enough money to pay for the medication because her brother doesn't pay her much in exchange for rent. Kate shared that she is unable to go to a pharmacy without her brother-in-law's assistance. All right, so once again, we're going to use our raise our hand tool. If you think, or if you suspect that this is human trafficking, go ahead and raise your hand. All right, looks like a large majority of us have our hands raised, meaning that we are all pretty much almost on board, almost all of us are on board that we start to at least suspect human trafficking. I think you're absolutely correct. We have quite a few red flags that really are standing out to us. The first one of which I don't know if anyone picked up on when we first met Kate, her brother-in-law said that she hadn't been to see a doctor. And now Kate is saying that she's already received this diagnosis and she's worried because she can't afford the medication, even though she's working 14 hours a day. She can't go to the pharmacy without her brother-in-law. And so we're seeing some control in her movement there. I would say I'm definitely concerned that there's at least some sort of exploitation happening here. And so if we're at this point, if Kate is our patient, how do we respond? Well, first of all, I always like to point out, what does our role as a provider look like? Number one is always going to be meeting immediate medical needs, right? That's why they're in our care, and that's going to be our priority first. But as we're doing that, if we are suspecting human trafficking, we also need to be getting more information, right? We've identified our red flags. We've asked our questions, and everything we're learning for some reason about our patient is making our guts scream at us. For some reason, the words human trafficking keeps popping in, even if you can't really pinpoint why exactly. How do we respond to that? Number one, we're going to want to report, and we're also going to want to refer to other resources. So let's talk about reporting first. So on your screen, what you'll see is the phone number for the National Human Trafficking Hotline. I'm going to talk about the hotline and who to report to, and then we'll talk about when do we report. So who do we report to? The National Human Trafficking Hotline. This is a national hotline ran by Polaris Project out of Washington, D.C., but it is often regional. And so what that means is that when you call to report suspected human trafficking to this hotline, that information will be going to law enforcement and service providers in your area. So for example, I'm based here in Houston, Texas. When anyone reports suspected human trafficking in Houston to the national hotline, that information is going to our local task force. So that's an incredible resource that we have. The hotline itself is 24/7. It has over 200 language capabilities. They manage a referral directory for other anti-trafficking agencies and organizations throughout the country. And it's who we want to encourage you to report any credible tips to. One of my favorite things about the national hotline that I love to share with others is that this is not like calling 911. You should never be afraid to call this phone number. They're very clear about what they're looking for, which are your gut instincts. The really incredible thing is that when we look at our role as a provider, I want you to notice that nowhere on this list does it say prove beyond a reasonable doubt. As healthcare providers, our role is not to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that something is human trafficking. We have people who have that job. We have law enforcement who are working on that. We have prosecutors who are working on that. But that's not our role in this fight. And that's something that we are incredibly grateful for. We do not have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. But when we start to suspect, when our gut is screaming at us, that's when we should be reporting to the national hotline. So that's the who. Now let's talk about the when. We're going to talk about minors first because I think that it's the easiest and most straightforward. Specifically here in Texas, but most states have similar legislation. I would encourage you to check out your state's legislation about mandated reporting. But here in Texas, human trafficking is considered a severe form of child abuse, which means that should we ever suspect a minor is being trafficked, what that means is that we suspect that they are being abused. And as mandated reporters, we are required by law to report that. And so it's very straightforward. We follow the same child abuse reporting protocols as we would for any other form of child abuse. So, like I said, this does vary somewhat state to state, but for the most part, they do tend to follow at least a similar pattern. Your state's CPS or DFPS within a certain amount of time, usually 24 to 48 hours is what those laws look like. So that's mandated. We are required to report a minor being trafficked. However, I want to also encourage you to make the second phone call to the national hotline. That'll help get connected to very specific human trafficking investigators in your area so that we can help close that gap between CPS and law enforcement in these cases. For adults, it's a little more difficult, it's a little more of a gray area. HIPAA requires consent. So should we ever suspect an adult is being trafficked, one of our adult patients is being trafficked, HIPAA requires consent. We encourage written consent or verbal in front of a witness, and that's just to make sure that you are looking after yourselves as well. But we do need that consent, which is why building that trust and building that rapport early on is going to be so important to this process. There is a little bit of a gray area here as well. One example of that is if you suspect your patient is being trafficked and they have shared information about their trafficker, that trafficker is not your patient. As long as you do not share any personal identifying information of your patient, you can report on that trafficker. So for example, you could call up the National Human Trafficking Hotline and say, I have reason to believe that Jane Doe is trafficking people out of her restaurant off of Main Street. She is taking their passports and is threatening their families if they try to leave. She's not paying them, et cetera, whatever we happen to know. And at no point did we share any personal identifying information of our patient. So that's a little bit of the gray area. And should we not be able to get consent, which is actually very, very common, I want you to understand that it is common for a person to not want to report about their own exploitation. We don't want to just say, okay, well, we tried. We want to make sure we can connect them to local resources and say, okay, that's fine. If you're not interested in reporting to law enforcement or anyone else, are you interested in any other services? And this is when I would recommend that everyone go ahead and check out the National Human Trafficking Hotline's referral directory for organizations in your area. Start to make those contacts, build partnerships, vet them a little bit for your patients so that you know what will happen when you refer. Let's get them connected to resources as much as possible, even if that means giving your patient the National Human Trafficking Hotline number and asking them to save it in their phone, right? Save it as a contact under a different name in case they decide they need it in the future. We want to do what we can to make sure we are getting them connected to resources, even if they're not yet ready to report. I want you to keep in mind that we have so many stories of survivors of trafficking coming back to the same hospitals that they had received care for in the past, because when they were finally ready to get out of the life, they remembered that nurse or that doctor or someone at that hospital made them feel safe. And so that's where they return back to. This is an ongoing process that we are now a part of, that we are asking you to be a part of. All right. So this is my contact information that you should see on the screen, but now I do want to take some time for questions. So if you have any questions, please feel free to submit them via the chat, and I will start taking a look at them. Okay, so our first question are there any hotline stickers available? You know, I know a lot of organizations around the country create their own materials with the hotline's information on it. I don't know that the national I'm not sure. I don't work for the national hotline, so I'm not sure if they are able to provide any with their numbers. But I know, for example, here in Houston, our organization partnered with the city of Houston a few years ago, and we created quite a few materials that had the hotline on it, including stickers, flyers, trifold cards, things like that. So if you're looking to get connected with some actual tangible materials, I would just recommend reaching out to the hotline itself. Remember, never a phone number you should be afraid to call, or any of the local organizations in your area. All right. Do we have any other questions? Let's see. Oh, someone is asking, can you email the PowerPoint out? We will be emailing, I will not be able to email the PowerPoint itself, but we will be sending out a link to the video. So if you have anyone else in your agencies or anyone else you'd like to check out the webinar, they're more than welcome to do so. I'll be sending out that link not too long after we're finished. Oh, and someone answered the question for us. It looks like the National Hotline website has printable resources. Well, there you go. Thank you so much. It does have printable resources. Thank you. All right. Do we have any other questions that I can answer for anyone while I have you here? We do have someone who just wanted to share some information about their organization. They run a 24-hour crisis intervention center for CST youth, which is commercial sex trafficking youth in San Antonio. It's the Youth Center of Texas. If anyone wants to check them out, thank you for sharing. Okay, it looks like we don't have any other questions. Oh, yes. So someone did ask, can we review the difference between domestic violence and human trafficking? That is an excellent question. It is one of those very, very interconnected knots that are sometimes really hard to differentiate when the trafficker is an intimate partner. So looking at the legislation and how the laws define domestic violence and human trafficking and how they differ a little bit is that we have that purpose. So we often have an action and a means that will match for both domestic violence and human trafficking. If anyone is familiar with the power and control wheel, Polaris Project actually published a very similar one for power and control and human trafficking, and they're almost identical. So we're going to see a lot of those commonalities. But for domestic violence, we don't have specific purposes like we do for human trafficking, which is sexual exploitation and labor exploitation. The easiest way to wrap our heads around this, and this really does only apply to when we compare these two, domestic violence and human trafficking, and I've heard it described this way before, is that human trafficking, if the trafficker is an intimate partner, can be considered a form of domestic violence. But it's with a very specific purpose, right? Either sexual exploitation or labor exploitation. To be very honest, though, it is such an interconnected knot that it is really hard. It's not something that we can necessarily just separate completely. So they're very, very connected. The other thing I always like to mention when asked about this is that incidences of human trafficking, especially when the trafficker is an intimate partner, don't always start that way, right? Just like any other forms of domestic violence, it doesn't always start with the intention to traffic, but it turns into that. And so that's just something that we need to wrap our heads around sometimes, is that it's subtle and it's psychological, and it develops into these forms of exploitation sometimes. And I hope that answered your question. If you have any follow-ups, you can ask now, or if you feel to email me. But yeah, thank you so much. Let's see. Oh, yes, this was a really good one too. What's the difference between wage theft and labor trafficking? I apologize. I find the easiest way to explain the difference if I use myself as a hypothetical. So please bear with me when I do this. It's the easiest way I have to describing the difference between wage theft and labor trafficking. So let's say on the weekends, I decide to get a second job and I want to make a little extra cash. And so I work out a deal with someone. I'm going to come to her house, help her out around her house, do a little gardening, help her on her to-do list. And at the end of the day, she's going to pay me $100. We work out the deal. Everything's in place. I show up on Saturday. The job is exactly as we talked about. I help her out around her house. I help her with her to-do list. I do a little gardening. But at the end of the day, she only pays me $20. That is wage theft. The reason that it is not labor trafficking is because we have no means of control, right? She's not forcing, defrauding, or coercing me into staying. I can leave and get another job. I can leave and not worry about my own safety or the safety of my loved ones. There's no means of control. So that's going to be the difference between wage theft and human trafficking, or in labor trafficking specifically. Someone did ask if we are offering CEUs, and I apologize. We are not able to offer CEUs for this webinar, but I'm really glad you all joined us. All right. If you're not looking for CEUs, I have someone asking if I'll be able to verify participation in this webinar. It's not an automatic thing, but we do have, and you won't get CEUs for it, but we can send certificates out for the participation in the webinar. If you just take down my email and send me an email requesting it, I can send you that participation certificate. If you're just looking for that verification, I'm happy to do that. All right, it looks like those are all of our questions. So once more, I do want to reiterate, thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon. I hope that this was helpful. And if you guys have any other questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'll be sending out, you'll be getting an email with the link to the video, hopefully soon. And yeah, everyone stay safe, stay healthy, and know that we're a resource available to you. Thank you so much for joining.